First, he wanted to control Libya by force. Now, Khalifa Haftar is after a political solution. And Egypt's president has laid out an initiative. It follows a series of military victories by the UN-recognised government in Libya. But will this proposal even be considered? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Brennan. Libya's warlord Khalifa Haftar aimed to seize power by force. He had the support of Russia, Egypt and the UAE, and everything was going well for him until last month. He suffered major blows in his battle to capture the capital, Tripoli, and his plan to unseat the UN-recognised government based there collapsed. Haftar's military losses were accelerated by Turkey's military intervention in support of government forces. Haftar has long resisted compromise, but now he's ready to talk. He's accepted a ceasefire plan proposed by his ally, the Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, that would start on Monday. It would include foreign fighters leaving Libya.
كما تهدف المبادرة إلى ضمان تمثيل عادل.
The initiative aims to guarantee a fair representation of Libya's 3 provinces in a presidential council elected by the people under the supervision of the United Nations. It will manage Libya's leadership for the first time in the country's history and unite all Libyan institutions. This will enable them to play their role and guarantee fair and transparent distribution of Libyan resources for all citizens. The initiative will prevent extremist groups or militias from taking over the state's resources. It will also entail a constitutional declaration that would regulate the upcoming political and electoral obligations.
Well, Haftar has blamed Libya's deepening divisions on Turkey's support for the internationally recognised government.
Turkish intervention deepens the state of internal polarisation by supporting the unconstitutional government of national accord with more weapons and fighters. It also depends on the state of international and regional polarisation around Libya in light of the conflicting interests among most of the countries involved in this conflict.
Well, Libya's UN-recognised government has rejected the truce. Forces allied to it say they'll press on to reclaim territory from Khalifa Haftar. He's still in control of the east and much of the south, where there are major oil fields. But government forces are now closing in on Sirte, the last major region before the traditional boundary between Libya's west and its east. That advance has come after government forces controlled areas surrounding the capital, Tripoli. They've also seized the city of Tahuna, Haftar's last stronghold in the west. They reversed the course of Haftar's offensive on Tripoli in May when they captured Al-Watia airbase. Let's bring in our guests now. And joining us here today, we have Guma Al-Gamaty in London. He's the special envoy of the Libyan government of national accord to Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco and Mauritania. Here in Doha, Omar Al-Shor, he's the founding chair of the Security Studies programme at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. And from Brussels, James Moran, former European Union ambassador to Egypt, Jordan and Yemen. He was also the EU's senior coordinator in Libya during the 2011 revolution. A very warm welcome to all of you. Guma, let me start with you today. Why has the GNA rejected this call for a ceasefire on Monday by Sisi and Haftar?
Because this is a one-sided call by Egypt, imposing things on Libya without any consultation whatsoever. The sides to the conflict in Libya are many. The GNA is an important part. Also, the House of Representatives or Parliament, which sits in Tobruk, has many of its members, far more than those who supported Haftar in the east, are now sitting in Tripoli for the last over a year and have their own leadership. Also, there is another state council in Tripoli. These institutions are the institutions which came out of the Skhirat Libyan political agreement. These are the recognized institutions by the international community. The GNA is the recognized government by the international community. All these are sides to the conflict. Egypt has offered an initiative only one-sided, only consulting with Haftar and Aguila Saleh, and not consulting with the other sides or even telling them pre-hand that it's going to launch an initiative. This cannot be a fair and just initiative from an honest broker. This is an initiative.
Okay. Omar, this is a unilateral call for a ceasefire. Did the Egyptian President Fattah al-Sisi ever really believe that the GNA would accept it?
It is very difficult to say what was he believing. Basically, the initiative is noise in the background. It's Egypt under the current government, the Sisi government, does not have a lot of credibility with many sides in Libya, even some sides within the east. The attack on the west and the intervention, the bombing of Tripoli since August 2014, the support for the failed offensive while you were doing a peace process, while the UN Secretary General was in talks with Haftar, and all the developments that happened under that does not really give it the political credibility to be the peacemaker in Libya in any way. It was not a peacemaker. It was actually a spoiler for a sustained spoiler for the peace process and for many of the UN-backed efforts. Now, to come after that and propose after, the offensive failed, and now the counter-offensive is progressing well, reaching cert now, to come at this point and propose a demobilization and disarmament process, like really the GNA, the UN-backed GNA, who successfully did stop the offensive and then launched the counter-offensive, to tell them now, hand over your weapons to a so-called LNA that no one really recognizes the legitimate army except for the Egyptians and the Emiratis and some of the other backers. It's really noise in the background. So who would take this seriously in any way?
Yeah, there's a lot in the Cairo Declaration that I want to get into in just a moment. But before we do, James, I just want to get an idea from you, whether you were surprised to see this strongman, this renegade military general Khalifa Haftar standing somewhat meekly beside Sisi and asking for a ceasefire.
Well, I don't think he had much choice. I mean, clearly the military scales are weighed against him. For more than 2 months now, he's been losing territory, losing key positions in the west. Clearly, as the other speakers have said, the offensive has failed. What are the options left for Mr. Haftar under those circumstances? Probably to try to get some breathing space, whether through a ceasefire or whether through other means. But I agree with the other speakers. Egypt is not best placed to make this initiative, given its past support for Mr. Haftar and the lack of contact between Egypt and the GNA in Tripoli, and indeed the GNA backers. There was a real problem, of course, between Turkey and Egypt and the wider region, and Turkey is an absolutely key player in all of this if a serious attempt at a peace initiative is going to be made.
Why do you think then it was Egypt that came forward with this and not the UAE or not Russia or any of other Haftar's supporters?
Well, I would have thought that Egypt would certainly have consulted with the Russians, with the Emiratis, and with others before doing it. It may not have been Egypt's idea. It could have been somebody else's idea. But Egypt, being a neighboring Arab country, with a obviously key interest, understandably, in the stability in Libya, I imagine that would have put them the least worst position, as it were, to offer this initiative. But I do agree with the other speakers. This is not an initiative that looks as though it has much stamina, much legs.
And Omar, how worried should Egypt be by a GNA advance across the east and towards the oil fields?
I'm not sure about worried, and I'm not sure about stability, really. I don't think the current government in Egypt wants the type of stability that the UN and many of the other international community members want, in a sense as a de-escalation followed by some sort of demobilization framed in the Sukhairat agreement, as which was a very, very detailed agreement. I was a bit critical of it because it was very ambitious. It was talking about handing over heavy weapons in 60 days, which was extremely unrealistic. But anyway, it is a good framework. I don't think Egypt wants that framework because the type of the regime that it will produce is not the type of the regime that Egypt wants. Basically a framework for a constitutional democracy with peaceful alternation of power and some sort of I wouldn't say federalism because it's a contentious word in Libya, but some sort of decentralization of power from the center to the different regions. That sort of regime type is the antithesis of what Egypt has at the moment. So it won't embrace this kind of stability. It will try to create instability to then produce a similar regime type to what it wants, which is basically a former general of some sort / warlord, current warlord, that takes over the country. The problem with that method is that Egypt actually had the firepower. It has a military that stayed intact, and since probably 1954, to be exact, was more or less controlling the political, economic, and security and military aspects of the country. Libya does not have that. What it has is a so-called self-declared Libyan National Army, was basically a bunch of military defectors / warlords, a group of tribal militias that got together, and with international mercenaries, professional mercenaries, and tribal militias that are non-Libyan from Sudan and from Chad. So that coalition really does not have enough manpower or firepower to impose some sort of a military dictatorship in Egypt, such as the one in Egypt. So what happened is that it basically lost the combat dimension, and based on the losses of the combat dimension, we're now seeing the political unfolding of the regime type that Egypt, UAE, and later on Russia had for different reasons than Egypt and UAE.
Guma, let's take a little closer look at this Cairo declaration. I mean, Omar was talking about foreign fighters being involved in Libya there, and one of the things that it has said or calls for is the withdrawal of foreign fighters from all of Libya's territories. I mean, aren't there, a lot of foreign fighters on both sides of this conflict?
Well, there are a lot of foreign fighters, definitely from day one that Haftar attacked Tripoli back in April last year. His force is a combination of international mercenaries. We're talking about not just the Janjaweed from Sudan and Chadian mercenaries. We're talking about a very important component of Wagner mercenaries, Russian special forces, Wagner mercenaries, some 1,600 of them, who Haftar used, and he used them to attack Tripoli, and they have been attacking Tripoli for the last 14 months. And it's only a month ago that the GNA, we managed actually to dislodge them and push them back, and at the end they've decided to withdraw them. And we've seen the withdrawal of the Wagners through Tarhuna and then Beni Walid. It was obvious to everybody, and they shipped them out in planes to Jufra and possibly maybe later on somewhere else. So the claim that Haftar heads a proper army, Libyan national army, is a fallacy. His force is just a combination of local militias and regional and international militias. And this is
but Guma, let me just jump in there, because I just need to ask how strong the GNA's fighting forces are, because it's clear that it's been the Turkish military intervention that spurred on these latest military battlefield victories. And a lot of fighters that have been battle-hardened in Syria have been joining the fight. So if they were to depart, how strong would GNA be without them?
Let's remember that, and Sisi and Haftar made a lot of this Turkish involvement, and they called it Ottoman colonization and all that. Let's remember that from April 4, 2019 until January of this year, almost 9 or 10 months, Turkey was not on the scene at all. The agreement we signed with Turkey was on the 27th of November. The implementation of that agreement started early this year. So there were no Turks in the first 9-10 months at all. And then Turkish support, logistical support, military support, hardware, equipment, and drones and so on started to come in. And obviously, it made a difference. But to say that from day one, Haftar was fighting the GNA, which is heavily backed by fighters and army and military support from Turkey, is a fallacy. And at the same time, Egypt, when it talks about withdrawing foreign fighters or foreign groups, it totally disregards the Wagner, the Janjaweed, the Chadians, and also Egypt's own personal military advisors and support as well, as long as, and also there are other mercenaries. I mean, there are pilots from Serbia, from Ukraine, from Belarus, and so on. So, you know, that's why when we say about this initiative, it's totally one-sided. It totally ignores what Haftar is doing, his attack on Tripoli since 14 months ago. And where was Egypt all these 4 months? Is it a coincidence that Egypt has never ever called for a ceasefire until yesterday?
Okay.
Is it a coincidence?
James, let me just jump in there because it was called by Sisi. But let's not forget that there was the French, the Italian, Russian and US envoys all at that Cairo announcement. There are a lot of players in the Libyan conflict. Do they all support this call for a ceasefire, for the two sides to get back to a UN-sponsored dialogue?
I'm not sure that they do. Certainly France has made its position pretty clear that it supports the Cairo Declaration. Now, the Italians, now speaking of the European scene, the Italians were represented there in Cairo, but I haven't seen any message of support for the declaration itself. I think they were more there in terms of being an observer. Don't forget, the Italians have, by and large, been a supporter of the GNA in Tripoli for other reasons than military ones for quite some time now. So that is a problem in Europe still, that we had two major European countries, France on the one hand, Italy on the other, taking different positions on this conflict, which has made it difficult for the EU itself to come forward with some sort of peace initiative, or at least to contribute more effectively to peacemaking. We need to continue to work on that in Europe if Europe is going to play its part. And Europe does have its part to play, no question about it, in the whatever the solution will be, political solution, because there is no military solution to all of this, as Mr. Haftar is discovering at the moment. One thing, though, on the foreign fighters story, I don't think that the Cairo Declaration is going to make any difference as far as the current foreign interventions are concerned. But sooner or later, that matter has to be dealt with. There are far too many boots on the ground from different interests in different countries fighting in Libya. And so long as they are there, it will be extremely difficult for anybody, United Nations or any particular country, to press forward with a real peace plan. Libya needs to get to grips with this itself, and it's not being given the chance to do so.
What chance does it need? What tools does it need to get those fighters out to move forward on its own terms?
I think much will depend now on what the GNA decides to do. It looks very much as though they will press forward. Almost certainly they will take Sirte. Once they have taken Sirte, they are then going to have some difficult decisions to make in Tripoli as to where next. Do they press on towards Benghazi to the east? Of course, Mr. Haftar's support in the east is fragile. Maybe there are alternatives there, and maybe some people there would welcome an intervention from Tripoli. On the other hand, I would expect there to be bloodshed on a much broader scale if indeed the offensive pushes forward. At that point, once they have taken Sirte, the GNA might decide then, in conjunction with its supporters, itself to try to once again return to the table. The difficulty there is going to be trust. The trust in Haftar himself and the people around him is near zero after what happened. One of your speakers laid it out earlier with the failure after the Secretary General of the United Nations visit last year, the failure in Moscow, when Mr. Haftar left the table, failing to sign, whilst Mr. Sarraj had more or less agreed to the ceasefire agreement there. Dealing with Mr. Haftar is going to be very, very difficult. But that, I think, is going to be the next stage after the fight for Sirte is over, which I expect the GNA will probably win. Okay. But I think that is perhaps the most important thing to look forward to now.
So let's ask Guma, what is the GNA's plan? Is it to keep pushing forward, to keep going into the east, to try to take all of Libya and try to unite it?
Well, I think Sarraj said it many times that the GNA, which is the legitimate government recognized by the international community, has the right to extend its control over the whole of Libya. So, yes, we have now pushed Haftar out of the whole of the West. Sirte probably going to be completed soon. Then we have Jufra, we have the South. Haftar's control over the South is very, very loose. And I think loyalties there would change very quickly. And we have another very important juncture, which is the oil crescent. Haftar has closed down the oil crescent and stopped and halted oil export. Libya depends entirely on oil exports for revenue, which pays salaries and pays subsidies for food and for fuel and for essential services like medical services and others. And now the closure of the oil crescent by Haftar is causing hardship and a lot of pressure, social and economic pressures on the Libyan population. So the GNA has every right to liberate those the oil crescent region as well, and take control of the oil fields in the southwest of Libya, so that oil can flow again, so that revenues can start again, so that the hardship of the Libyan population in the west, in the east, in the south can actually be eased. This is a legitimate right, and the NOC, which controls the oil sector in Libya, the National Oil Corporation, which is part of under the control of the GNA, has every right to be in control of the oil sector again. This is according to resolutions by the national security, and the whole international community recognize that the NOC should be in charge of the oil sector in Libya, not Haftar or anybody else.
Will Egypt let Haftar lose control of those oil fields in the oil crescent?
No, they will probably try to back him by one way or another. The issue is there are limits to the military capacity. Egypt does not have a good record in terms of military victories. Actually, no records in this century and the last one, almost zero. Whether it's counterinsurgency or conventional warfare. So there is an issue there to be highlighted, and also the political record of whether of Mr. Haftar or his backers are not that great either. So the political record specifically, we had constant reneging on the political process. And we know that spoilers are different types, but the famous type is the absolute spoiler, and I think he fits that category quite well. So that's the problem with making peace. I think if it will be done, it will probably be done with other forces in the east. There's another issue with you referred to about the going to the east. We have to remember the IDPs' plight, the internally displaced persons. There's about over 100,000 of them in the west who are displaced from places like Benghazi and Derna and other towns in the east. And many of them are actually fighting with the GNA. So given the ties in Libya, I don't know how will this affect loyalties at a later stage, especially with tribes that are very large, like the Magharba tribes in the east and others. This type of loyalties may easily shift at some point or another. Again, Egypt and the UAE will try to make sure that these loyalties in line with the political project in the form of Haftar or another.
Omar, I'm just going to jump in there because we've got 1 minute left, and just in that last minute, I want to get an idea from James as if the situation on the ground in Libya and with all the international players has shifted enough for a turning point in Libya right now.
Not yet. I don't think so, no. I'm afraid that it looks as if we're going to see more military action for a little while to come. One can only hope that it's not another year or more. The country has suffered enough. Since I was there in 2011, I returned last year a couple of times and I saw it for myself. The Libyan people deserve better. They courageously overthrew a brutal dictatorship, and they're still suffering for it now. And I mean all Libyan people, west, east, south, wherever they are. So I think we have to hope that it won't go on for too long. But I don't think the military story is yet over. As I say, a lot will depend on the attitude of the GNA, and of course on the attitude of the principal backers, Turkey and Russia in particular. And can Europe get it together to join in and play a more effective role? Big question for the European countries as well.
OK, well, on that note, we'll have to leave it there for today. Many thanks to all our guests for joining us, James Moran, Omar Ashur and Guma al-Gamaty. And thank you, too, very much for watching. You can see this programme again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Brennan, and the whole team here, it's bye for now.